These recordings are copyrighted material under U.S. copyright law. Federal law provides severe civil and criminal penalties for unauthorized reproduction, distribution, and exhibition. The purchaser agrees that these recordings will not be duplicated in any manner, nor will they be circulated outside the physical location of the purchaser to which the recordings were sent, without the written permission of FTC Reports Incorporated. The purchaser further agrees that it will not resell or make an exchange of any kind of these recordings. The information contained in these recordings should be an accurate and complete record of the public portions of the FDA Advisory Committee meetings. However, FTC Reports Incorporated assumes no liability for the accuracy and comprehensiveness of the information presented.
Mercury vapor from amalgams as it relates to urinary levels. The question we have for you, we're having difficulty understanding the relationship of that concern with the endpoints or markers of toxicity that are followed through the term of the studies. And clarification on your concern for that would really be helpful.
So let me make sure I understand. Why are we interested in what the acute levels are, and how does that relate to the later clinical effects?
That's right.
Like, why would we be interested in it, for example?
Right. And how does it help us assess the risk?
Right.
I would say it doesn't help you necessarily to look at the risk, but theoretically, if you have a fetus that's exposed to 30 micrograms per day, for example, and you look 2 years later, because of the redundancy in the CNS, you might see nothing. It will take 20 or 30 years to see an effect. So I would have liked to know what the urinary levels or the exposures are at the time of the placement of the amalgam, because there may be a cumulative effect of exposure to very high levels of mercury that may not be manifest until decades later, especially in the young.
I'm just looking to see who we're missing before we go too terribly much longer. Not too many. Okay. People are filtering in. I think the other issue, at least as I've heard, is that if you get a spike up in concentration for some brief period of time, and that happens to happen at a critical part of fetal development, that could be not a long-term consequence, but a very short-term consequence of two things happening at once that will critically affect one another. Other people want to speak to the issue of acute level changes with manipulation and how, or what the concern is how that might relate to clinical phenomena? Dr. Diamond?
Yes. One thing, it might provide some kind of insight into some of the situations where people have developed some sort of reaction very shortly after placement of the amalgam. In studying that, it may be able to provide some insight into that, even though the people who might be studied may not react at all, but at least it might provide some dose, some exposure level that could possibly use as a benchmark for individuals who may be found to be susceptible for that sort of acute response.
Go ahead. Did you want to speak?
Yes, right to your question. I would think it's reasonable to ask our colleagues at FDA to search for safe concentrations of mercury vapor after an acute or short-term exposure. I would expect that such safe doses are either at the chronic level or higher, most likely higher. And I think that would be fruitful. I've checked the ATSDR website, which is an agency that has a habit of doing that, and it wasn't there. But that doesn't mean someone hasn't done that worldwide, or maybe, and our FDA colleagues are quite adept at doing that, so.
Some of the toxicokinetic studies involve short-term high administration to normal volunteers, too.
That's true. There is one that was in the literature on that.
So inhaled. So you get some sense of what.
Right.
Well, I don't see anyone eager to contribute to comment right now, so I think we have discussed question 1. Does anyone else want to comment on question 1?
Just when I heard from the FDA asking for surrogate markers other than urinary excretion of the mercury, and I was wondering, particularly in complex toxicity problems such as the potential mercury exposure, could we suggest to add a salivary content and exposure of mercury? And it's similar to what we do with clinical trials, where we use 2 or 3 surrogate markers that are converging towards the same issue. I think that we should suggest other surrogate markers. And one of them could be, for the acute or later on, the salivary content of mercury.
I don't know about salivary mercury measures. Okay. Tonine?
Yeah, I have a question, I think, for FDA, which relates back to sort of the first day's presentation on mercury being up class to class 2 instead of class 1. And my recollection of what was said about devices is that special controls could be put in effect for that. And I was wondering if 1D and sort of the issue of reproductive outcomes, I think that's 1D. Anyway, the possibility of looking closer at people who are occupationally exposed to dental amalgams for reproductive outcomes, if that's an example of something that could be a special control for the future, because I feel like that data gap is huge, and perhaps at the highest levels of exposure, which I assume would be the occupational exposures, we might gain more insight on the reproductive outcomes.
Let me just draw a distinction between occupational exposure monitoring and the device. So you're talking about those with occupational exposure, is that correct?
Correct.
Do you want to comment on that, Ms. Rosecrans?
Susan, will you see if you can find Linda Kahn too, please? Just so she can come in. Obviously, we regulate devices, and OSHA does the OSHA part of it. Special controls can be a guidance document, it can be a patient registry, and then the law gave us other. And whatever the circumstance fit for a device, if we can identify and it can provide reasonable assurance of the safety and effectiveness of that type device, then, and that allows us to keep it in class 2 because we try to make it the least burdensome level of control needed to provide that assurance of safety and effectiveness. So I think the overall answer is yes, because we have that category of other.
Let me just caution the committee. Our question is about the white paper, and the task of drafting regulatory language and labeling things and special controls takes a lot of time and effort. We have not talked about that, nor have we been charged with that. So we may make a recommendation to the FDA that they should think about that. But I wouldn't get in, I don't want us to start getting into a discussion about what we think the right labeling pathway or special controls are for the device. Dr. Alderson, do you know?
I totally agree with you. That is a whole nother, probably a advisory committee meeting.
Dr. Goldman?
Do you, while you're up here, because in the course of the years of regulating this product, do you have data on the exposure levels that are achieved when the product is used, either applied, new, or drilled through in patients?
I'm afraid I wouldn't be the person able to answer that question. Let me look to Dr. Alderson.
I seriously doubt that we have that data at all. I'm not aware of it, if we do.
Dr. O'Brien?
Do you have a name at OSHA who's interested in mercury? I'm not going to get into the issue. These links between the agencies are very hard to find. Is there a mercury person over there?
I don't know about a mercury person, but we do have a person at OSHA that we speak with.
Actually, not NIOSH. NIOSH has a person, and they've written a recommended standard and so forth over the years they've worked on mercury a lot.
Georgeson?
Yeah, just a small addition to my prior statement about, estimating a safe short-term concentration. That ties into Dr. Goldman's prior point about reproductive or developmental toxicity. So in utero exposure from when you are pregnant, and then at a high short-term exposure, and if you've got a safe dose on the basis of a short-term exposure, it should look at those kind of studies and use those kind of studies in part for determining such a safe concentration.
Dr. Burt? Oh, yep, Dr. Clausen.
Yeah, I'd just like to come back to the adults' exposure and ask a question of the dentists in the room, and that is, have you ever made amalgam fillings for a patient, and the patient really, truly had what you would expect from elemental mercury poisoning? And from occupational exposure, we know that one of the most easily measured thing is trembling. So has that been experienced in your practice, or has this been indicated frequently or even a few times in the literature?
So I take it the question is, did anyone have a personal sort of clinical experience of, after setting mercury-containing amalgams, of someone looking like they have classic mercury poisoning? Dr. Taylor?
I've not seen that, and I'd also add that I'm comfortable to say that we wouldn't, in dental schools, we wouldn't even be taught to look for that. So we wouldn't even ask about, if we were to call a patient, and other dentists, practicing dentists chime in, if we were to call a patient as a follow-up, say we had an extensive procedure and we did a large amalgam and we were concerned about how the patient was doing, that would not be on the checklist.
Dr. Diamond?
Yes, I'd like to respond to just the question about standards. Is that in industry, what we do is we look for various standards, ASTM or ISO, or and if none exists, then we look to the literature to see if there's some established levels, or sometimes to proceedings to decisions or insights that come out of meetings such as this, for some kind of guidance with regard to that, and then that's discussed with the FDA, but there's always a scientific basis behind that.
Dr. Zero?
Part of my question earlier about hypersensitivity was to understand this 6% and what that meant, and what was the full range of the expression of that, and the reporting of that. So I'm not sure if this is included in that. I have no way of knowing because I don't know what that means.
Right.
Well, what I was getting at there is there are some things that we know for sure that elemental mercury will produce. And then there's these 100 other things that people think it might be associated with. The one thing that everybody agrees with is how steady your hand is. And if no dentist has ever heard of that or experienced that, then it's not a problem for the adult. Correct? Or is my logic wrong?
We wouldn't know. We wouldn't know.
If you can't hold your hand still, you're going to go to somebody.
It may happen 2 days later.
that's okay.
They may not associate it with the filling. It doesn't sound like anyone has seen, or it's a clinical standard phenomena of tremor after placement of amalgams.
I guess I would then say that we don't have one example, from what I'm just heard, of anyone ever being poisoned by a classic example of what happens with elemental mercury exposure. Is that correct?
Well, we have a limited set of practitioners here at this table, for one thing. Though we have a huge opportunity to get at many of these unknowns. With NIDCR has established 3 very large practice-based research networks, and where the questions that have come up from the testimony outside, from the testimony here these past couple of days, as well as the questions that we are raising, we actually have the exposure going on daily, and we also now have an organized network for which we could develop, suggest topics to discuss. The turnaround time could also be potentially very quick to get at some of these unknowns that are important. For example, the question about trembling, and manifestations of acute manifestations of mercury toxicity. We certainly have a network in place. When I say we, that is the people of the United States has a network in place to potentially be able to get at some of those issues. The sample of practitioners here could answer questions, but I certainly wouldn't draw any inference on our experiences as they would be generalizable to the population.
Dr. Fleming, then we'll come up.
Yeah, I'll try to address the issue of the tremor. The first comment I would make is it's not like our patients drop dead over the hitching post when they leave. So what I think the issue is that very often the first person they call when they have a problem of that magnitude or that sort, there will be accompanying symptoms of anxiety, sleeplessness, perhaps excessive sweating and urination, things like that, which I have seen in my practice, reported by patients who were treated elsewhere. The issue there is, again, the patients are more likely to call their physician, not the dentist. They're not going to call a dentist and say, I am sick, I am anxious, I cannot get out of bed. And it may happen the next day, the next week. It may take many, many months or perhaps years of accumulation, which doesn't fit the classical pattern of an acute mercury exposure, such as in the chlor-alkali industry, for example.
Ms. Cowley, did you want to add?
Yes, I can only say amen to what Dr. Fleming said. One of the hardest, shall I say, perhaps the most dangerous situations we have in this country is this incredible gap between dentistry and medicine. And speaking from the TMJ perspective, our implant patients are treated by the dentists, they get implants by the dentists, and just like examples we heard from the patients yesterday, the dentists do not address any of the medical health issues. It is totally out of their realm, but then when you go to a physician with these incredible sequelae, there is absolutely no understanding of what you have just gone through, or a year later, and the implant is in your brain, and so forth and so on. So if anything, the FDA has done is to bring together neurology with dentistry in this room today. I think you have done a heck of a service to the American people, and I applaud you.
Dr. Rizzo, and then
From the point of view of neurology, we frequently see patients with tremor. I'm not aware that it's common or really even occurs that we see people who have tremor as a result of amalgam restorations. When we see people with tremor, it's generally from exaggerated physiologic tremor, Parkinson's disease, inherited disorders. From the perspective of a neurologist, when we evaluate tremor, amalgam isn't even on the radar screen. So that's a different perspective.
Dr. Burton, and then
I guess I just have to, I'm an oral maxillofacial surgeon, have to answer Mrs. Cowley's comment about dentists. And I've been fortunate, I've worked with her for many years on the dental products panel, but I wouldn't say that the dentists are completely quite off the screen. There are large numbers of us, both in oral medicine and oral maxillofacial surgery and oral pathology, probably other specialties. I mean, I've worked in a hospital for 25 years, and most of my dental colleagues, at least the dental school I work with, most of them claim that I'm no more a dentist than the guy that cleans the hallway at this level of education. So I guess I would defend the dental professions a little bit in this arena, and the fact that I'm not sure that we're quite that unaware nor that unobservant or perhaps unconcerned to not pay attention to those symptoms. And I will tell you that there are many disease processes that are picked up by the dental profession because of the fact that those patients do bring symptoms that are somewhat inexplicable at times to them, that they've taken to their family physician, internist, et cetera, and have not had answered.
And just a comment regarding the availability or a line of healthcare exposures for neurotoxins or other toxins that we deal with in dentistry. My particular practice, we can identify neurotoxin effects with the temporal pattern. I think the discussions I've heard the last 2 days would again maybe take proposed mercury toxicity out of that exposure. So we may not see that because we may not see, or there may not be an existing acute pathology or toxic effect. So in my practice, as well as in our dental school's exposures, I just have not seen that in particular.
Dr. Goldman?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand in terms of the way the clinical world has looked at this issue, Kurt, that, I mean, I've been involved in a number of exercises to come up with just environmental history questions for physicians to use and triggered by different indications. And most of us were taught, I was certainly taught, that exposure to mercury from amalgam is minimal and that one shouldn't think about mercury toxicity from amalgam. I have never included a question about recent dentistry on an environmental exposure questionnaire that I've worked on. It's never been suggested. Now, I will have to say there is something, I was recognizing this, and I appreciate your asking that question, because there is something that's happened in the last couple of days in these discussions to kind of at least move me a little bit further over into being a little more concerned than I was before. And I will tell you that the two things that have concerned me. One is that some of these exposure data, the range of exposures, and there is a lot of new science, even though the white paper kind of implies there's not, but then it uses the studies. And there are a lot of new studies that do show, that do document an association between amalgam and levels of mercury in urine, and more than I would expect given what I was taught. And I'm sure that that's true for the others who were taught what I was taught, because we were all taught that at one point. And so I'm taking it more seriously, that there could be exposures, A. Two, that there could be acute exposures, and that there could be symptoms associated with that, and that maybe it is worth inquiring about whether there are symptoms. We haven't done that inquiry. And I just took a quick look at PubMed just to see, if someone's published on that question, and there are no publications other than, the Kingman study included a question about tremor in the questionnaire, and that's about it, So I think that this is an area where I don't think we can make a conclusion based on the literature. It's kind of silent, but I will say, and on an indirect basis, I am more concerned about this today than I was last week, whatever that means.
I would say movement disorder neurologists, of which I am one, do ask about metals, but we don't tend to ask about dental work. So there's an association, we think about occupational and industrial exposures more than we would think of because of tremor.
And when you suspect, you check and you do a 24-hour urine for heavy metals. And And the condition is also related to the company that it keeps in terms of signs, and there can be evidence of neuropathy and so forth. So we do look, but we don't ask about mercury amalgam restorations.
No. Dr. Sacco?
I would just caution about the use of registries like we've been hearing about, try to look at these questions, or even questionnaires. I think if we wanted to look at this, we would do studies, probably a little larger scale studies, and some of them designed perhaps like the factor-lit vac study, and perhaps like the Kingman study, which did show us in very well-documented outcomes with an exposure of interest that there wasn't at least a dose-response relationship. A registry with just questionnaires attached to it on dental patients may not give us the answer.
Okay. Question 2. Does the draft FDA white paper objectively and clearly present the current state of knowledge about the exposure and health effects related to dental amalgam? We're going to go around. Dr. Porter?
If you're going to go around, you can start over here.
Very good. Yes or no?
No. And I'm only going to stick to the one area in clinical pharmacology that I think that I've sort of emphasized in this meeting. And that is that I think that there is a very great lack of a good PK and pharmacologic analysis of the data in this paper. There's enough data here that you could almost consider a second paper. I think that it should include absorption, distribution, excretion. Metabolism, I'll leave out, although it's important to note that, as somebody did, that it doesn't stay elemental mercury in the body. It should include an evaluation of the 2 human studies which are autopsy studies, looking at brain levels, with an emphasis on the variability of these numbers, as well as the outliers, and preferably with some modeling. It should look at the issue of accumulation, for which there is some very good animal data at the very least. It should conclude the dentist study, the Woods et al. Study, that shows that there are high urinary levels in some of these patients, or at least in some of these groups. It should address the issue of excretion. Is this urinary or is it mostly fecal? And is the urinary technique that we've been using really the best technique to use to judge what kind of exposure a patient has? I'm personally very doubtful of that. Those are just the highlights, I think, of what a good pharmacologic summary would be. And I can even, I would guess that Dr. Larry Lesko's group is still here at the FDA. If it is, he would be an ideal person to contact and work with to generate such an addendum or a section or whatever you would like. But I would say that in this regard, the white paper is deficient.
Just note for the record that our first 4 votes don't technically count, but I still want to know what you think. Yeah, Dr. Jung, who's a member of the PCNS Advisory Committee, who's the consumer rep from the advisory committee, who on our committee is a voting member, was scheduled to attend. She couldn't attend because of a personal emergency, so she's not here. Dr. Diamond.
I have to agree with Dr. Porter. I don't think it reflects, let me qualify that. Taken as a whole, it doesn't. From a perspective of reflecting the current state of knowledge with regard to controlled clinical studies, it does, and I think it does an excellent job at pointing out the benefits as well as the deficiencies of all of these studies. So from that perspective, I think it does. Where I think it does not is in the broader picture by not looking at the studies by excluding a lot of studies, you're missing some of the potential insights that may that might provide some insights into some of these, I want to say hypersense, some of these other reactions that would not necessarily be seen in some of these, some of the more controlled studies.
Dr. Fleming?
I would go with no. The 2 reasons that I would give are the tremendous data gap in the methods of risk assessment and connecting that to symptomatology. Very difficult to do, but we still lack that information. And then secondly, allergy, frank allergy, is simply not quantified.
Okay, I just want to reiterate to the committee, does it present the current state of knowledge? Not whether the current state of knowledge is adequate, but does the paper adequately state what the current knowledge state is? So just taking your comments at face value, I'm not asking you to change what you said, but I'm just bear in mind, it's not a fault of the paper if there's uncertainty. It is a fault of the paper if it inadequately addresses a question or a knowledge state. Ms. Cowley.
Not being the scientist on this panel, I don't think I can adequately assess that, so I will
Thank you.
pass.
I have to agree with what was said. I just think that the paper is way too focused and not broad enough in considering a lot of other things that have been published.
That's a no.
It's a no.
Dr. Clausen?
I would say yes. I think it does state and summarize the current knowledge. I don't think it tells us everything that we would like to know because it's basically not known. And it doesn't give and suggest data gaps, but I'm not sure that that was part of the question. So as far as going back to the original, does it state and summarize the current knowledge? I think it does that very well.
Dr. Rizzo? Please turn on your mic.
I agree with Dr. Clausen. I think, yes, it does a good job summarizing existing evidence. I think that it could have done a better job in terms of grading. I think that it could have given reasons for excluding studies that weren't included in the data tables. But on the whole, I think it does a very good job at summarizing what is known, and most of the fault with what is not known is that the research hasn't been done.
Dr. Sacco?
I think there are deficiencies, so because there are deficiencies in clearly reviewing the literature, I'm going to vote no. And the deficiencies are some things that people have already outlined. I think the literature search strategy may be an issue. Weighing of the evidence, I'd like to see a little bit more weight and adjustments of the evidence, addressing vulnerable populations, and I think, as is mentioned, I think gaps in the literature do need to be identified, even though it may not have been the remit of the paper.
Dr. Taylor?
I'd vote no, very consistent with Dr. Sacco's comments. I'd also include a concern for assessing the quality of the previous reviews from which this was based.
Dr. Lee?
I would vote yes, although this white paper is not broad enough and having some deficiencies, but based on the two new studies that have recently published, that was carefully reviewed, and I would have to think about the evidence that pointing to the results of it.
Dr. Olson?
I would vote yes. It asks about the current state of our knowledge, and certainly we know there are gaps. There are big deficiencies of our knowledge that we don't have, especially about subsets of vulnerable populations, namely people who may have the substrate upon which a mercury burden would give them additional or give them de novo problems. But on the other hand, when one looks at the recent articles, especially the two in the JAMA, that were well done, and even with their deficiency that we would like to see them go out longer in these folks, and I assume that perhaps they will do that, I think it gives us some good insights into the effect of these devices.
I'm going to confuse you all. Dr. Honine, please.
I would say yes on number 2. I think it is an objective and clear presentation. However, I would agree with the comments that it would be helpful to see an expansion of the white paper to include a broader range of papers and both other search strategies as well as potentially including more of the original 200 papers, or a clearer rationale for why each was excluded.
Dr. Lusker.
I have to say no. I felt that the neurological issues were very well covered. There's other issues, maybe not so much as frank allergic responses, but there's been a lot of issues with autoimmune disease and publications that weren't included. And given knowing the literature, I don't want to make any specific comments on them. They may not be that strong of papers, but it would have been a more balanced presentation if it was included as well, so we could at least see it.
Dr. Meyer.
I have to say no for the reasons that I alluded related to the searches. Most importantly, if a position paper is here to give the current knowledge, it should be all-encompassing, including the whole breadth of the literature, and there is still some literature missing in the white paper.
Dr. O'Brien.
I would say yes, but with a caveat, and that we add to that sentence, does the draft FDA white paper objectively and clearly present the current state of knowledge about the exposure and health effects related to dental amalgam? And I would add, used under clinical research conditions, because in terms of the public, they should know that there's a vast difference of what goes on in a research clinical study and the average practitioner's office.
Dr. Dorson.
I find that the FDA white paper clearly and objectively presents the state of knowledge on the health effects from chronic exposure related to the dental amalgams. I would like the white paper to emphasize estimating a short-term safe dose and a short-term concentration, and better characterize case studies, which they specifically did not, were asked not to do. In contrast, I think that the characterization for the exposure was deficient, and that in what should be done is to determine or find the release of mercury from amalgams as it ages in vitro and in vivo, giving both average and upper bounds, and for different amalgam types.
That was a no, I think.
I think because
Or
the
is it a yes?
sentence, because the sentence says exposure and health, I suppose the answer would be no.
I don't want to, I was interpreting, I should have asked you. I don't want to.
Well, the sentence does say exposure and health. I think the health is well characterized, the exposure is not. The word is and so therefore the answer has to be no. I'm
you.
sorry.
Dr. Goldman.
Yeah, hi. My answer would be no, and I do think that the paper was written clearly, and I do think that it was written from an objective point of view. So if you just read the question literally, it would be hard to say no. But the fact that the criteria for selection of studies is never laid out, and the criteria for ranking or rating studies are very unclear, and in some cases, I don't agree with some of the things that were said about studies in terms of, it's implied, for example, that occupational cohort studies always have to have a non-occupationally exposed cohort as well, and which is not the case, and there are other things like that. So I think that there's some problems. I felt that there were some deficiencies on the outcome side in terms of a lot of studies related to immune effects, cardiovascular effects, developmental neurotox effects. Just a few of those were not reviewed, most of which I think came about because of the choice to use the ATSDR and the EPA reviews as a starting point, which I think may have been the wrong decision to make, because the questions that they asked us and that they seemed to be asking were different questions than the questions that EPA and ATSDR were asking. The exposure data is also not complete, and I could easily find what I considered to be relevant and important exposure information online that is not reviewed in this. And so there may have been criteria that were used to not include those data, but I don't understand what those criteria were, on what the basis was for certain studies to be picked out and others not. Then I have to say that it was not objective and clearly presented.
Dr. Zero.
I would say no, based on many of the points raised, particularly in my case would be lack of identifying the limitations of the available data. I think that just reporting data and giving it as it is, although there was some qualifications of the data in terms of generalizability, I think that there needs to be more discussion about the limitations of the outcome measures that are currently being used. And I think a very important thing is the completeness of the data in terms of the search strategies, which was also raised earlier.
Dr. Goldstein.
No, and again, just based upon the generally accepted criteria for a quality systematic review, does the clinical premise make sense? I think we've had a big discussion about questions about even the underlying premise and some of the underlying assumptions. The search strategy was given, but again, we have major deficits in terms of the way the search was carried out methodologically. There were exclusion criteria, but we don't have the list of papers that were excluded or the reasons why they were excluded. And again, just looking at some of the materials we have, and as was stated, there seem to be other papers available that may directly be relevant. There's no statistical analysis of the data looking at odds ratios or risk factors, et cetera. So from those standpoints alone, I'm concerned.
Lynn, could you turn off your mic?
Yes, sorry.
I would vote no. The primary reason was in at least my opinion, the sample strategy, again, was concerning. A single search engine sample would exclude possible other sources, especially within other division departments within the agencies or within the government, federal or local, that could help provide more information on mercury exposures as well as in a relationship to the primary concern. And I too would feel that the lack of the information regarding why the exclusions of some studies deferred from a full evaluation.
Jane?
I think that the paper is fairly well written, but I would also vote no for the same reasons that have been reiterated, particularly with the limited literature review and the data gap that I think exists.
Dr. Hughes?
I would vote no. For a lot of the methodological reasons that have been given with respect to doing a systematic review, I think this falls short of the sort of current gold standard. Even if it doesn't identify other papers, I think it really affects the credibility of the white paper. I would question the presumption of assuming that the older reviews are still complete and of the standard that we might expect today. And I would consider reevaluating older studies as well in the context of newer knowledge. And I would look to see more consideration to collation of information across the studies. I think the draft paper really goes study by study individually and doesn't really think, particularly from a quantitative point of view, about the information across studies. The other big issue that I have with the paper is that it's very focused on comparison of mean levels in exposed, non-exposed populations. And I think it's absolutely critical to think about the distribution, whatever marker you look at, whether it's urine mercury levels or any other marker. It's critical to look at the distribution of those markers in the population that might be exposed to amalgam fillings. And obviously, we're then talking about essentially the general population. And I think there's a lot more information in these papers about the distributions of exposures And I think when you start looking at that information, you raise the concern that there are some subjects in the population that may be getting levels which are not too dissimilar from levels which have been associated with neurologic deficits and so on in certain studies. I would also, I think, maybe this is going beyond a white paper, but many of the recent studies, it wouldn't be hard to contact the authors and get relevant data which would help address the questions at hand.
Dr. Burton?
I'll vote no because of the, rarely as the last person, you get, everybody else has sort of said everything. I have to be very honest, though, that I think it's sort of a semantical answer, because I think that those, I have to be honest, I thought I would vote yes because I think that the people who did looked at the question, and I think that the white paper does, to, within limitations, objectively clear that. They clearly present the state of knowledge, but I think that we're all drawn to the various shortcomings, whether it's search design or other portions of that, that make us not support that. I guess, like I said, so it's a no, but it's a bit of a semantical no. And I think those who voted yes voted that because they answered the question. And I think that really, I think this is an important vote, but I think more of our concerns really are addressed in the next question in terms of that. But I will vote no.
We have a procedural dispute between the executive secretary and the chair. In my committee, I vote. As chair of the device committee, you don't vote unless there's a tie, but I'm going to vote anyway, so. Using my prerogative. I actually vote yes. I acknowledge the concerns about the inadequacy in terms of a systematic review of the data, but I think this is an unusual circumstance. Usually in drug approval, where I mostly work, you would get a document from the sponsor and a document from the FDA, and they nicely play off one another with different interpretations of the same data, different bodies of data being brought in those documents. Here it was a little bit of a challenge in that we basically had a solitary document, so I took it upon myself to act like the devil's advocate and go out and find everything they didn't find. In fact, there are many things that were not noted here, and it was impossible to know why they weren't here. But the substance of them was no different, in my opinion. Now, that's not something one should need to do, theoretically, in a systematic review. It should be all laid out so that you can decide whether you agree with the decisions that were made or not. But I think the findings were objectively presented. I think they were clearly presented about the knowledge. I think, though, there was not a sufficient categorization of the unknowledge, if you would, what we don't know. This is a fairly clear and objective statement of what we do know, but it is balanced by a great deal of lack of knowledge. And I think it is worth, in this kind of setting, quantifying what relevant unknowledge there is, even though it is not the FDA's task, at least in my understanding and mine, to go about conducting that research. It is part of understanding the exposure and the health effects to be able to clearly identify what is not known and is potentially relevant. So it's a yes, but. I would say that the, if you count my vote, it's 13-6. Oh, 13-7. So that's for the record. For question 2, 13 no, 7 yes. Deep breath. Question 3. As you see on the screen, given the amount and quality of the information, mind you, you could vote no to 2 and yes to 3. Just, so just want to. So given the amount and quality of the information available for the draft FDA white paper, are the conclusions reasonable?
Is that page 34? Is that what you're taking?
Yeah, I would say Roman numeral 6. The final paragraph would be taken to be, it says update/review conclusion. I mean, I could read that. Just based on an evaluation of the extensive literature reviews conducted by ATSDR and EPA and an assessment of the health effects-based exposure reference values for elemental mercury derived by those agencies and WHO and AACGIH, no information was found that would change the comprehension of health risks for inorganic or elemental mercury and mercury in dental amalgam. In an effort to obtain new information that might improve understanding or change risk estimates for the use of dental amalgam, 24 peer-reviewed scientific articles published primarily since the reviews conducted by ATSDR and EPA, and 10 peer-reviewed articles from the ATSDR and/or EPA reviews deemed to contain important and relevant information were critically reviewed, period. Compared to previous analyses performed by USPHS, Public Health Service, no significant new information was discovered from the review of these 34 articles that would change the risk estimates by FDA for the use of dental amalgam. No significant new information was discovered that would change the risk estimates by FDA for the use of dental amalgam. That's the conclusion. Question is, based on the information in the white paper, amount and quality of information available for the draft white paper, not necessarily in it, are the conclusions reasonable? So we'll go in reverse. Dr. Burton.
I'm going to vote no. I'm going to vote no, and like I said, I feel that more of the issues revolved around this question because I think that it's in the conclusions or where the shortcomings of the white paper really come into play. It's because the gaps in knowledge that we've all discussed for the last couple of hours in the white paper and in the information that we have available to us at this time raises questions in my mind whether those conclusions are reasonable, because those conclusions really make you feel that it's you're pretty comfortable with the outcomes and there really are not any potential risks. And in my mind, I'm not sure that those risks have been quantified out where I'm comfortable with those either. But I guess that the draft FDA white paper, the conclusions of safety, at least in my mind, are not fully verified from the information that was made available to us in that.
Dr. Hughes?
I will say no, and it's primarily driven by the fact that I think there are marker levels in the population which may be consistent with modest risks to the subjects concerned.
Jane?
I would also vote no. I think that with additional information, the conclusions may still be the same, but without that additional information, it's really hard to make that determination.
Dr. Seneca?
I would vote yes. The primary reason being the level of some of the prospective studies were convincing enough to me that within the confines of the 34 articles I read, it supported the conclusions.
Dr. Goldstein?
I think a qualified no. I think if you just read what it says, no new information was found that would change anything, I think that that's factually correct. They didn't find any new information that would necessarily change anything. But I think the spirit of the question is there something here that we or the public needs to be concerned, or health professionals of the public needs to be concerned about because of a lack of information, and that was not addressed. And those are all of the issues that we were talking about.
Shiro?
I also vote no, and I'll leave it there.
Dr. Goldman?
I'm also voting no, and on two bases. One being that the levels of exposure, the newer studies indicate that they're higher than FDA had once thought. And second, that there really isn't evidence of safety for the fetus.
I have a hard time distinguishing these two questions, but I'll try. I agree with the FDA white paper again that the review of the prior information that focused on the chronic health effects is adequate and well done and does not change the chronic health values. I'm agreeing with that. However, because the FDA talks about comprehension of health risks for amalgams, and that includes not only the toxicology but the exposure information, I find the exposure information not adequate, in my opinion, the way it's now stated, to be able to say that it is with or without risk. I just like to see the exposure information and compare that to the chronic health values, which I think are well wrought and as I said before. The last part, it says, the review of the 34 articles, I don't see any of those articles changing the chronic health risks that we now have. But again, I'd like to emphasize the inclusion of case studies, which were specifically excluded, and the development of a short-term health risk value, which might give us a handle, once we have the proper exposure information in hand, to quantify whether we're expecting health risks from the acute and episodic episodes.
Dr. O'Brien?
I-
Oh, I'm sorry. Dr. Dorson, could you just reiterate what your summary
I think
vote
the
is?
overall would be still a no.
Yeah, I think you said no qualified.
I'll just say no briefly.
Mr. Maher?
No.
Based upon the charge that FDA people had, which was to review the data post the 97 and look at the, I would have to go back to say yes, the conclusions are appropriate. However, on the other hand, when I look at the earlier data and where the earlier reference exposures were established and looking at the current levels of potential exposure from amalgams, I'd basically be scared to death to say that not to be rethinking about how to evaluate this data. But based upon what they reviewed, there isn't, I don't see very much evidence that would require that there's a concern here right now.
Dr. Honine?
I would say no to this question because I think it's critical to identify the research gaps before drawing conclusions about whether or not there's additional concern. I think that there's serious research gaps, particularly with respect to reproductive outcomes and fetal exposures. And I think the occupational studies that were included in the 34, while they are not perfect, do suggest levels of exposure that could be of concern both directly to those adults and for any reproductive outcomes.
Dr. Olson?
Again, reading the question rather literally and straightforwardly, I would say yes, because, again, it asks us to consider the information since 1997, and that goes to the amount and quality of the information available. I am troubled by the fact that articles were excluded that may show light on this. However, I also heard that other information was looked at and doesn't change anything from what we have already seen. Therefore, I will stay with yes.
Dr. Lee?
Yeah, my vote is also yes, although there are a lot of deficiencies and not broad enough. The information presented, the second question was adequate. I also did some reviews of those papers not included in this review, and I cannot find the information that would change this vote.
Dr. Taylor?
I'd say no, and I'd reiterate the concerns expressed about methodological shortcomings as well as perhaps not sufficiently recognizing the gaps in knowledge. So I wouldn't, with those omissions and shortcomings, I would think that it's not reasonable, the conclusions are not reasonable.
Dr. Sacco?
I'm going to say a qualified yes, based on, again, literally reading the question, which is given the amount and quality of the current information, I think the conclusions reached are that there is no real change in the older recommendations based on what is saying. I recognize there are gaps, but I think given what we have in front of me and given some of the quality of the data reviewed in this, I don't think that the health risks have changed in my mind.
Dr. Rizzo?
I would vote yes. I think that the review of the available evidence since 1997 doesn't show any objective new reasons to be concerned. There are clearly deficiencies in the way the review was conducted with regard to exclusion of some papers, which probably, however, wouldn't change the conclusions. There are gaps in the research but that's not the fault of this white paper, so I vote yes.
Dr. Clausen?
Yes, I would also vote yes, and and I would like to explain maybe why. In regard to, looking at the literature, and if they use the appropriate search engines and what have you is a potential concern. However, I guess one thing that minimizes that concern, I haven't heard a lot of papers that have been announced here that they have missed major papers. I recently have reviewed the literature for a textbook in pharmacology, and at the present time in editing a book for toxicology, and I'm not aware of any major papers that would alter the conclusion, even though they maybe should have done it. So it might be an academic exercise. In regard to exposure, yes, I would like to have more information on exposure, but they were supposed to review the literature, not do experiments, so I can't criticize them on that. I think a question about fetal exposure is very interesting and is an area that more research needs to be done. Again, it wasn't their job to do experiments to solve this problem. And I think, the other major problem is, the gaps in knowledge. And again, I don't think it was these people's responsibility for this white paper. And therefore, I think the conclusions are reasonable, and the amount and quality of the information, I think, is quite good. So the answer is yes.
I think the paper is objective. My problem is, though, that we're looking at the keys under the light. There's just too many things that we don't know, too many things that have been excluded. I think this was an opportunity to go back and look at some of the issues that we talked about. For example, what does urinary mercury excretion mean? What does mercury levels in hair mean? How can we take those together and come up with a reasonable exposure assessment? Opportunities to look at susceptible populations, to look at variability, and none of those were done. So although the conclusions are based upon what's presented, I have no problem with that. I think it's very limited, and I vote no.
Ms. Colley?
I would vote no if I had a vote, particularly based on the absence of information on the vulnerable populations, and those vulnerable populations that we have yet to identify in the future with genetic testing and so forth. We also, it's as though everything is just fine, and yet we know there are specific risks. We don't know how to manage the risks from this. So the semantics say, yes, the conclusions were reasonable, but I think, if anything, this shows us how much we need to know to make reasonable decisions as patients and consumers.
Dr. Fleming?
I would vote no. I cannot, for two reasons, vote yes. One is I don't think that we have, as I said earlier, considered the data gaps with respect to risk assessment and how we quantify that. And secondly, my conscience won't let me vote yes. I've treated thousands of patients through the years, and my assessment of this is that I must vote no.
Dr. Diamond?
Yes, I would vote yes, based on the power of the studies and the quality of the studies, and and personally, I don't think that I agree with the statement that the risk probably would not, the risk estimates would probably not change. But I'm voting no primarily for one reason, and part of the charge was to obtain new information that might improve understanding, and it's that particular statement and the absence of that other information that might provide whatever modicum of broader understanding is deficient, so that's why I'm voting no.
Dr. Porter?
My non-voting no is expected, of course, and I think that it's purely on the fact that although the health effects analysis is not bad and the outcome will unlikely change, I think that we owe it to the public to have a decent clinical pharmacology analysis without experiments, just an analysis of the available data, and we don't have that.
I'll just comment. I think I would also vote no. It's a complicated no, in the sense that I think the conclusion that the risk estimates haven't changed is probably right, but the uncertainty of the risk estimates is one of the important things to state, which is not stated, I think, particularly in potentially vulnerable populations and this subset of individuals who seem to be able to accumulate or have higher levels with what would be considered a standard exposure is not well understood. I think that risk at this point is not easily quantifiable, but parameters could be put around it. I think the vast majority of the population who receives dental amalgam is extremely unlikely to have any ill health effect from it. But it is impossible to exclude that there's, well, it's not impossible. It's always impossible to exclude, but it's hard to even accurately quantify what subset of the population may be at what risk of problems. So that, I think that's where the precautionary principle comes in, and some of the concerns about pregnant women, children, need to be better laid out in the context of this document. For the record, the vote was 13 no, 7 yes for question 3. Is that right? Very good. We have a few more things to do after voting those questions. There's the opportunity for each of us to say something in summation after the vote on this panel. Not in my panel, but no. So I'm just going to look at you as I go around the table and see if there's any summary comment you would like to make. Dr. Lusker, Dr. Emler.
Yeah, I think the major thread or the take-home message that I have is that the federal government and the agencies need to force dentists to provide informed consent to the patient and making sure that the patient is going to be well informed and making their appropriate decision towards the use of this material. Having said that, I don't know what would be the mechanism, whether ADA has to step forward or the federal agencies. I leave it as a question open at this point, but something has to be done. I'm a periodontist. I do a lot of, and the oral surgeons must also do that. I do a lot of bone grafting, and any time that we implant something, we must have an informed consent. So I think it's a must at this point, particularly in populations such as young children, pregnant people, and immunosuppressed patients.
Dr. O'Brien, care to say anything?
As the literature supports that dental amalgam is generally safe, as we can see. However, there are unknown risks involved in the handling of dental amalgam. I, for example, was asked by a dentist what he should do because he accidentally swallowed a little white cup that had water in it, that had amalgam in the bottom of it. And so the fact that it's around and it's a toxic material would put this in the category of a risk, maybe in the area of antibiotics, aspirin, birth control pills, but it's in the risk space. However, we use all of those things. And so it isn't that we don't use things without risk, but it has to be, you need a lot of care and careful attention to it.
Dr. Dorson.
Okay, some research opportunities for our colleagues at FDA because someone said that they wanted them. So I have 3. First of all, I think it would be useful to continue to follow up the children in these existing epidemiology studies. If the study is over and you can't do double-blind, okay, then do single-blind. And if you can, within these studies, characterize the polymorphisms if possible. These really are great studies. We should continue to use them. The second is to study the polymorphisms in relationship to the use of the uncertainty factor of 10 that we use for our risk values. It is standard operating procedure now to replace these default factors with actual data. There are ways to do it, codified by the World Health Organization and also used by different federal agencies and other countries' federal agencies. And if you study the polymorphisms, you can get data-based uncertainty factors that may be greater than 10 or less than 10. This is doable. And then finally, I would encourage our FDA colleagues to listen well to our public commenters and ask the public commenters to, at best possible, quantify their exposures. So if they have a case individually or know of someone that has a case, try to get quantification of the exposures or potential exposures. Because without this quantification, it's difficult to use the case, as we all know. Thank you.
I feel like I should give some of my time to Dr. Luster. Are you trying to?
Okay. Yeah, I agree a lot with Michael. I also would like to see some data on exposure level estimations within the population and not the use of median values. And I would also like to see some regulator take it on and not accept this ATSDR and the EPA early reference values and look at the newer data, or say if they can develop some newer data to reestablish reference doses based upon inclusion of susceptible populations, genetic polymorphisms, et cetera.
Yeah, I'd want to recommend that FDA consider kind of a broader strategy be taken that might include collaborating with the other agencies in addition to picking up on their work. But because it occurs to me that, for example, some of what we've suggested could be very much remedied with a little more toxicology lab work, which NCTR could do, but through the National Toxicology Program, maybe some other parts of the government like the NIEHS could get involved. Also that it's been suggested that some additional epidemiology could be done. I think that's a good idea, doing more follow-up on the existing cohorts. But it also occurred to me that, NHANES would support that most adults in our country don't eat fish at all. And so there are a lot of women of childbearing age who do not eat fish, who are, therefore, their only exposure to mercury, by and large, would be through dental mercury, mercury amalgam, and that might be a way to begin to try to get a handle on what's happening very directly to the fetus. And but that's the kind of thing that FDA wouldn't generally do by itself, but perhaps NIH, if they could be interested, could fund that kind of research. It just seems to me like that kind of the occupational data. I have residual concern about the dental workers, even though those studies are not perfect studies. But why not get NIOSH involved with that and get their help in picking those studies apart? And what can we do to find out what's going on with those workers? Because I think there is a possibility that that those are positive studies. It's just very hard to say with the kind of time that we had to review them. So,
Dr. Zero?
I'd first like to say I came here kind of neutral, thinking that there wasn't much of a concern with this issue, and now I'm sort of leaving here that there may be a concern. So that's where I'm at. And I also want to sort of thank the panelists around the table from other fields that I don't normally get the chance to interact with, for all I've learned from them. I think that's been a very educational process, as well as from the audience and the public that have contributed so much to this meeting. In terms of gaps, in addition to the one related to fetal development, I really I have a concern of, in the adult population that has been raised in terms of a research agenda of adults that have an existing body burden and then get acute exposure from dental treatment, which will be referred to as removal of amalgams and placement of additional amalgams. That acute exposure needs to be understood a little bit better and the implications of that on health. I think that has to be looked at from what I've learned at this meeting. I also, as a dental professional, feel that as a professional, we always have to put the interest of patients first, and regardless of any other issues that are out there, and that's really our obligation. And I think this has been an excellent exercise in really looking at and addressing the needs of patients going forward.
The worm turns. We have 20 minutes, so I'm going to stop you after you talk for 1 minute, everybody, from now on. So, Dr. Goldstein, you have a minute.
Lucky me. Well, again, I think, there's no question from a neurologic standpoint that mercury is toxic, and I think that it's a continuous risk, not a dichotomous one. So having said that, I think in the next version of the white paper that not only should it consider the risk side, but it also needs to consider the alternatives. That is, and I tried to question quite a bit about this, is there an absolute reason that only this could be used, given all the gaps that we have and all of the issues? The answer may be yes, that there are situations where this is the best alternative for a patient. But given what we've heard from other countries as well, and from these trials, given the inception cohort bias, that the alternative may be better in many, as good if not better in many circumstances, and then you don't have to deal with even this potential risk.
Having been a lifetime educator in dentistry, this has been a very fruitful experience. And from the providers, both on the panel as well as the audience, this has brought to light or a new level for us. And as an educator in dentistry, I would like to recommend that the FDA work with the dental communities and the dental sponsorships to bring this to the next level. And I would like to echo your comments regarding the redo in the white paper.
I would like to thank the FDA for putting this meeting together. It was a very worthwhile experience for me, and I learned quite a lot from the public as well as from the panelists around the table. My personal view is that amalgam is going to go away. It's just a matter of time, but I think that we need to get more data, do more research, and find some answers.
Dr. Hughes?
I guess I would just reiterate a comment made earlier that I think there is more information out there in these existing studies, and I think the FDA or a collaborating agency should reach out to some of these studies and try and use the information that's there to answer the specific questions of interest. I think equally, it sounds like there's a lot of activity in Scandinavia and perhaps other countries, and reaching out to hook into that would be useful, I think.
Dr. Burton?
As with Dr. Zero, I and as a dentist for 30 years, came here thinking that there was potential that there were a few individuals, which I hate to say were idiosyncratic, who were potentially at risk. But I think that this at least provided to me some information that raises a level of question in my mind that there may be more people who are at risk than we fully can understand. The data that we had presented, I hate to say, supports what we already knew, but what we found out was that there are gaps in what we knew, particularly in regard to special populations, that raises questions about the use of this material in the long term. I agree very much that technology within 10 or 15 years, or perhaps even less, will make what we're talking about probably moot. But the truth is that in that interim period, we need to be aware of what the shortcomings are and try to protect our patients. And I think that the FDA needs to look at this in a broader sense and look into some of the issues that we've raised, and perhaps then revisit this issue either, again, as a white paper or through a joint panel or the dental products panel.
As I said before, I think the population-based information is pretty clear. There's very little to no risk, but the tails of those populations, there's already data on individuals who had very high and very low levels. One of the advantages of population-based research is you can sample at those tails and see if there's any characteristics of the individuals from the data already collected that are predictive of being very good or very bad handlers of mercury, as that case may be. And those data from those studies may be available already to look at that kind of analysis. Dr. Olson?
Yes, I think it's very important to have informed consent, and I think there should be a change in the labeling of these amalgams to, if you will, silver mercury or mercury silver amalgams, so people really understand what is being put in their mouth. I think also, as other people have said, from what I can understand, these are going to go away and go away fairly soon. So I would recommend also that women who are of childbearing age, especially the pregnant women and also children, really be especially counseled on getting these in their mouth. The other thing I would like to see is clearly studies of mercury in people who are immunocompromised, people with immunological disorders, not just for what the mercury may do, but it may shed some light on their underlying problems.
Dr. Lee?
I also appreciate the opportunity to be part of this meeting, which has been a great learning experience for me. And I just want to point it out that my votes were based on the current available information. And I think the future further studies are really necessary to further define the potential risks. And one area we mentioned quite a few times, that was the allergic reaction. When I was the dental student, I was told the allergical reaction rate in the population was less than 1%. But we have seen recently during this meeting, it was presented as 6%. So there has been a dramatic increase. And on the other hand, there are alternative materials available. And I would encourage dentists to consider those available alternative materials for those high-risk population, although we do not know what exactly the risk is yet.
Dr. Taylor?
This was a tremendous learning experience and an honor to work with colleagues around the table today and yesterday. I was particularly struck by the testimony, like Dr. Zero from the public. Like Dr. Zero, I came having read the white paper and felt I was pretty set, and it would be an pretty easy decision to assess questions 2 and 3. So the testimony struck me in this way. It led me to think that perhaps there are a constellation of symptoms, a constellation of experiences that may be related to the provision of dental care that we have not paid close enough attention to and need to focus on. In that regard, I come back to the practice-based network as a potential vehicle to be able to address many of these questions. Not only a registry, Dr. Sacco, but a few other study designs that could be done. And we could possibly look at the model of osteonecrosis of the jaws, where actually the practice-based networks have been engaged to address that issue. So I see need, and I see areas in dental education as well as in dental practice. I was also struck by our colleagues in terms of technique and methodology with the use of materials. And we've selected an approach for using amalgams in those difficult restorations, if you will. And perhaps there are ways that we might be able to seriously look at technique, teaching our dental students new methodology, not new methodology, but more focused methodology on those difficult restorations.
Dr. Sacco.
Thanks for allowing me to participate, and learned a lot, and opinions were changed a bit as to what I heard here. I think the recommendations to the FDA are we need to advocate for more well-designed, mainly epidemiologic studies to better clarify the exposure-risk relationship. I would say studies are difficult in this day with funding being diverted where it has been, and it makes it more difficult to do research, but it's clear research is needed. And the only other thing I'd say maybe to the public, though, is I'd hate to see an overreaction and a panic. And I think having all their dental amalgams pulled at this point in time when we don't have enough information could also be just as deleterious.
Dr. Rizzo.
Thanks for letting me participate today. It's an honor to be here and to hear from the public as well. I think that because there is uncertainty, informed consent is essential, and I think that before anyone has mercury amalgam replacements, there ought to be some discussion and informed consent. I think the white paper has good bone structure. I think it's not broad enough, and I think that we need to increase the scope of the review, including different databases. I think it's especially important to explain why studies were excluded, especially some potentially important studies that were mentioned by the public. Maybe they are up to snuff, and maybe they're not. And if they're not, I really want to know why. I think there are lots of opportunities to point to directions for new research. We could probably sit around all day and think about what we might do, and we could include some ideas in the white paper. There are potential populations that are at risk, and we need to know who they are, and we need to know what the effects are of acutely elevated levels with dental procedures like polishing, amalgam, and so forth. Thanks.
Dr. Clausen.
Yes, I too found this an interesting experience, and I think as I look back at it, when I came here and what I thought the question was and what I see it now is quite different. When I came, I thought we were to look at the current available information and if that's adequate or not adequate. But basically what we're saying, I think, is what has been done is not adequate, which is a very, very, very different question and maybe a very, very important question. We are now saying we don't, or at least as I see it, we don't disagree very much, but we think that there's more that should be done. And and I think we all agree with that more research needs to be done. It's unfortunate at this time in history, it's very difficult to find money to do research. But we got to find it, and if the public wants more research on this, we have to find money to do it.
Sure.
Like the other members of the panel, I'd like to thank everybody. I've learned a lot. I'd like to thank the public at large. There's a couple issues that I want to address. The first one is, I know we're charged with looking at the white paper, but I think we should think in broader terms. And like our colleagues in Sweden and other countries in Europe, perhaps we should consider the issue of mercury within a broader perspective, environmental impact and other issues that were not part of the discussion today. The second message is actually for the FDA, and maybe I'm talking now more as a citizen than a scientist, but knowing what I know about thimerosal, for example, and that 6 injections of thimerosal will result in exposure to the child of about 30 micrograms, so a total of 180 over a 2-year period, I'm asking myself, how is it that 6 times 30 micrograms over 2 years is unacceptable and 20 micrograms per day is acceptable?
Ms. Cowling.
Thank you for the honor of representing the patients. I think we need a definite, renewed emphasis on informed consent. People need to understand what is going into their bodies. I think an awareness campaign would not be a bad idea to alert the public to the fact that there are alternatives and the presence of mercury within amalgams. To me, the most important issues are to try to understand what happened to the people who talked to us yesterday and today? Do they have something going on that is totally unrelated to amalgam? Is what is happening to them related to amalgam? And we won't know until we look. So that is the focus that I would like to see among all of the others. When I went to Congress in 1992 and the visit resulted in a congressional hearing on how our FDA and NIH ignoring the dangers of TMJ implants, the legislative staffer looked at me and she said, "How many people have these devices?" I said, "I don't know. I'm in my house getting phone calls. I have no idea." And she said, "You know what? If it only happened to you, it's worth an investigation." So if it only happened to one of those people, I think we need to look at it and find out why. Along the research lines, FDA working with NIH, NIBIB, NIDCR to develop new materials would be terrific. I know the dental division has a tremendous interest in the biomaterials division, bioengineering. We ought to be looking to auto regeneration. We're doing an awful lot in other areas, and this is a whole new field that is opening up. I think that's it. Thank you again.
Dr. Frum?
Well, for me, words can't express the honor that I've had serving with this distinguished panel. There are two issues that I have to lay before you. One of them is, could it not be that we are on the verge of one of the greatest medical discoveries in the last 150 years? Could it be? Just could it be? Sometimes I entertain the thought. I think, secondly, informed consent is an absolute given. I think that it needs to be given prior to the installation of amalgams or any dental material that we use, any dental treatment that we perform. And lastly, I would like to ask the FDA to consider restrictions on the use of amalgam in high-risk populations, which would include pregnant women and children under 6. If that is within the scope of the regulatory authority of the FDA to do so, I think until we have adequate methods of risk assessment, until we have established what the risk is, it seems to me not to make sense to continue doing something that's going to add to the burden that we'll have to treat later. Thank you again.
Dr. Diamond?
As this is my baptism by fire, I'd like to say that I am honored to be a member of the dental panel and to be part of these proceedings. Given the understandably emotionally charged nature of this issue, I am struck by the dignified, respectful, and productive interactions between all the participants at this meeting. To me, this says that we're all focusing on our purpose here, communicating our views and learning from each other. I believe that we have all gained a broader perspective from where we can move forward toward an objective and more accurate understanding of the risks, which is in everyone's best interest.
Dr. Porter?
Although I hope I've introduced some concepts of clinical pharmacology that will take in the device part of the FDA, I really want to say that it was a great meeting. I really enjoyed it. It was a pleasure to be part of it, and I think the FDA did a great job in organizing it.
We're not done yet, so hang in there. I just want to reiterate for the committee and for the record and for the press, what we commented on was the draft white paper. There are no official recommendations on any kind of change in regulation, labeling, or otherwise. The last little bit that went on was personal reflection on the part of individual committee members. The charge was to comment on the white paper. The vote is what the vote was. And now it's FDA's task to take that vote and the contents of the discussion into their consideration in that regard. I'd like to ask Dr. Alderson to give us any closing comments or questions to the committee. We're at your service.
Well, do I have the last word?
No, I do.
That's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, you're all to be congratulated. We are elated with the input you've given us. We're elated with the assessment of this very, very difficult situation. both from a science and a regulatory perspective. This is not an easy situation we find ourselves in. Your input the last 2 days, the input of the public, is very critical to our process of making decisions relative to public health of products we regulate. The expertise and science that you have brought to this issue is so critical to us. We make our decisions based on the best science that we can bring to bear on the issues that face us. Certainly, your contributions are great to us. You heard input and opinions from 52 members of the public. You heard from a U.S. congressperson, Congressman Watson from California. This is part of our process. We want it to be as transparent as we can make it from both the science perspective and also the public's perspective. So we're going to take your recommendations, your comments, and we will start evaluating the next steps in what we do, both with the white paper and this whole issue of dental amalgams. So I can only say thank you for all you've contributed the last 2 days. I do want to provide some additional information about the process of sending comments to our docket. Everything that's submitted to docket will be publicly available through FDA's docket office. However, and this is very important, because of legal concerns about privacy, FDA does not normally post comments from individuals on the internet. We will have them internally, but we don't post them for the public. If you want your comments to be available for electronic access, please include as a cover to your comment a signed statement saying that you understand that if the comment is posted on the internet, it will not be redacted, but will be posted just as you submit it to us. If you want to delete some personal information like your home address or telephone number, please make those deletions before you provide the written permission to have that comment placed on the public internet. The transcript of this meeting will also be posted to the website. If you have comments you would like to submit to the agency for consideration, we encourage you to make those comments to the docket that we previously provided the number to. And that, with Mr. Chairman, I'll leave you the closing comments.
Thanks, Dr. Alderson. I just want to thank my co-chair, Dr. Burton, all the committee members, the public who testified, the great contribution on everyone's part. I just particularly want to thank the FDA staff, FDA professional staff, scientific staff. Sometimes take a hit in the public, I would say almost inevitably. They do a terrific job. They arranged a terrific meeting, organized things, got people the chance to speak. So I thank you for doing that. It benefits the public. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.